Hi, this is Keith Metzger, and this is part one of a video that will go through the framework of the organization of the peripheral and the autonomic nervous system. I would suggest that you watch this prior to reading the Stern textbook. It should really help to guide you through that in a little bit broader context, and then when you get to the textbook, you can really focus in on the details. Please be aware the textbook is still required reading. This is part one. In part one, we will really focus on the overall framework of the nervous system, as well as innervation of what we will know soon as somatic structures. So here are our session learning objectives. We will go through the vast majority of these, but I just want to make you aware that you will dive more deeply into them in both the reading as well as in the team-based learning session itself. So when we talk about the overall organization of the nervous system, one of the easiest ways to construct a framework is to think about dichotomies or contrasts between two things that are generally opposed to each other. And some of this you've probably already been exposed to in other contexts. At the highest level, we really can think about the nervous system in terms of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And from a structural standpoint, or what are the components of each of these, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is composed of all other nerves. One area that often gets people a little mixed up, here we're seeing a ventral or underside view of the brain. There are a number of nerves that are extending out of the brain called cranial nerves, and the vast majority of these, while you might think that they are a portion of the central nervous system, are actually a portion of the peripheral nervous system. So just be aware of that. Don't worry about the exceptions for now. So for the central nervous system, while we really took a structural approach to dividing it into its different components, it's useful for the peripheral nervous system to think about it from a more functional standpoint, or what are the essential functions that have to happen within this portion of the nervous system. And one of the most really obvious ways to do this is to think about the sensory division or the motor division. So we need sensation to come back from the periphery towards the center, and we need messages to come from the center out to the periphery to enact different types of actions. And here's just a little bit of a diagram. In this middle, you're going to get used to seeing this. This is a cross section, or here we're seeing half of a cross section of the spinal cord. And there's this central portion and then a more peripheral portion. We'll call these gray and white matter, but we'll really target those a little bit later on. And on the top, we're seeing sensation coming from the skin out from the periphery towards the center. So sensory towards the central nervous system. These are sometimes called afferent nerves. On the bottom, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing a signal coming from the center out towards, in this case, a muscle cell, where we can now enact some sort of action. Motor is traveling away from the CNS, and these are often referred to as efferent nerves. So I've heard this from students. I know what you're probably thinking. How am I supposed to keep these straight? Efferent, afferent, they seem exactly the same. Here's the word same, split it apart. Sensory is synonymous with afferent, and motor is synonymous with efferent, at least when we're talking about the peripheral nervous system. So sensory, afferent, motor, efferent. Just a nice little memory aid there. So now that we've talked about the types of innervation, we can think about the kinds of structures that need sensory and motor innervation. There are lots of different kinds of structures throughout the body, and the pathways of innervation are very different depending on whether we are talking about what we call visceral structures that I'm showing you here, or another type of structure that we'll talk about in a minute. So visceral structures, and I think you should say this over and over to yourself, are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So smooth muscle, you need to think broadly, not just thinking about, for example, the smooth muscle within the wall of the gastrointestinal system, but also, for example, smooth muscle within arterioles. That's another example of smooth muscle, or a lot of duct systems within the body have smooth muscle within them. Cardiac muscle, that's pretty obvious. And glands, not only your glands that you might think of, such as salivary glands, but also things like the pancreas, various organs within the gastrointestinal system. All of these are considered visceral structures. The contrast to this are somatic structures. Somatic structures, think about skeletal muscle, connective tissue. Really, if it's not visceral, then it's somatic. So smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands compose the visceral structures, and everything else is somatic. Now, there are a little bit of nuance to where these are actually located. Visceral structures in general are found within body cavities. And when you think about the cavities of the body and you think about these structures, I think that makes sense for the most part. The thorax containing the heart, the lungs, which have smooth muscle in the form of arterioles that travel to and from the lungs, the abdominal cavity, the pelvic cavity. So visceral structures, for the most part, are found within body cavities. If you think about the converse to this location, these body cavities, really this shell around the cavities, this is where we find somatic structures, and this includes an extension off of these off of this shell, which are the limbs. So here we're seeing an axial cross section through the body. This is in the region of the thorax, so this is anterior or towards the front. Here's posterior or towards the back. And if you see, here are our cavities, our pleural or lung cavities, and our pericardial or our heart cavity, and that shell around it in which we find somatic structures like bone, cartilage, skeletal muscle. Okay, that's the body wall. So as I mentioned, there's a little bit more nuance to all of this as well, and a few exceptions. And really the exceptions relate to the location of visceral structures, which, while I said are found in the body cavities, can also be found within the body wall. And so the real classic example that we use to point out these visceral structures within the body wall is the example of skin. So here we're seeing a cross-section of skin. We're going to dive a little bit more into the histology of skin later on in the course. But in this cross-section, there are some structures which fall into that smooth muscle, not cardiac muscle, but glands categories that are included within that definition of visceral structures. And examples include the erector pili muscles, which help to elevate hairs, give you goosebumps, sebaceous glands, sweat glands, and smooth muscle contained within vascular and specifically arterial plexuses that supply various regions of the skin and of the body wall. Okay, so let's go back to our diagram, and hopefully you have an understanding of the division between the central and the peripheral nervous system, and you understand that there are two general functions that need to be supplied to and from our peripheral nervous system: sensory and motor. And now we know that there are these different types of structures, visceral structures and somatic structures, that need to receive motor innervation and send sensory innervation. So let's add those to our diagram. Okay, so here we're seeing sensory, which needs to come back from visceral structures, and sensory, which needs to come back from somatic structures, and motor, which needs to go to visceral structures, and motor, which needs to go to somatic structures. So we're going to start talking about how we actually get information to and from these structures. And we're going to really start off with somatic structures, talking about how we get sensation back from somatic structures to the central nervous system, and how we get motor supply to somatic structures. And again, remember, these are within the body wall from the central nervous system. We're starting off with somatic structures because it's the simplest of the pathways. It will seem complicated at first because we're going to be introducing you to a lot of new parts within the spinal cord, but you're going to be using these parts throughout part one of this recording as well as part two. So just a little bit more complicated because we're getting introduced to a lot of different new anatomical structures. Okay, so I need to give you a little bit of orientation here, and really where we're going to be living when we're talking about all of these different types of pathways, at least in the beginning, are in and around the vertebral column. And so here we're seeing a oblique dorsal view of a vertebral column. So this is some of the lumbar vertebrae. A little bit higher will be thoracic vertebrae. And ventral is towards the top of the screen and the left. Dorsal, or think about the back of the body, is towards the back of the screen and towards the right. So we're looking at this a little bit of an oblique view. And here we have two adjacent vertebrae with a spinal cord that's running right down through them in this canal called the spinal canal. And so just to orient you on a gross anatomical level, at every single spinal level, we have a pair of nerves. We're calling them spinal nerves, but I think you'll see in a minute we will get into a little bit more of the nuance of what these are actually called, the different points. But the real basic idea is that there is a pair of nerves coming out at each level through a hole between the two vertebrae called the intervertebral foramen. Okay, that means foramen meaning window, and intervertebral between the vertebrae. So the window between the vertebrae. As you can see, and we'll see this a little bit later, these nerves split off into one that goes a little bit more towards the dorsal side. And remember, think about from our embryology what the muscle mass back here was, and a larger branch going more towards the ventral side. Okay, so now let's take a look at this from a different perspective. And this is going to take a little bit of a frame shift in terms of your visualization of what we're looking at, but I want you to think about us taking this oblique view. We're going to turn it around a little bit. Okay, so our diagram is flipped around almost 180 degrees, and I'll orient you again right here. So here's a slightly more diagrammatic view. Now, instead of dorsal being down here, dorsal is towards the top of the screen. And this is how we are going to look at these from now on, really for the rest of this recording and really for the rest of the course. So dorsal towards the top, ventral towards the bottom. We've done a cross section through a vertebral segment. Here's the spinal cord in the middle with this central gray matter area and this peripheral white matter area. And here you see on either side a nerve coming out. A lot of stuff going on in here we haven't talked about. Okay. And then we see, like I had mentioned, a branch going towards the dorsal region and a branch going towards the ventral region. Some of these layers in here, the pia matter, the arachnoid matter, the dura matter, we haven't yet talked about. So don't worry about them too much, but these are just things that you may see and come across in your reading. And definitely later in the week when we talk about the spinal cord, these are things that you actually will see in lab. So let's take this and actually make it even a little bit more schematic. And this is a diagram that I drew, and it's really one that I think is pretty useful for understanding these pathways. So it's the one that we will be using for really the remainder of the course. So again, we've taken out the bones, we've taken out all of those linings. Now we're looking at, again, ventral towards the bottom, dorsal towards the top. Here's that butterfly-looking gray matter in the middle, and here is a branch coming out dorsally, a branch coming out ventrally, and these are those branches towards the dorsal surface and the ventral surface that I showed you over here, and then on the previous diagram, on the more realistic drawing, we actually showed you as well. Okay, and here, there they are highlighted. So let's go through all of these different parts that we're talking about. Where are these branches going to and coming from? And how do we actually get to those and from them? And to talk about this, we really have to go back to something that we mentioned earlier in the week, this idea of somites. So remember, we talked about the body being really a series of segments, and the skeletal muscle, as well as parts of the skin and the connective tissue, are derived from these structures called somites, which are really just paraxial mesoderm. These eventually will migrate into the body wall and form all of our skeletal muscle, much of the connective tissue throughout our body. Okay, so here we're seeing a dorsal view. We've kind of scraped away some of the ectoderm. There's our neural tube in the middle, and here we're seeing these segmented somites. If we were to take a cross section through this embryo, the somite is all of these structures that then breaks up into a number of different components: a sclerotome, a dermatome, and a myotome. It's the myotome, which will then break off into two muscle masses: a smaller or less significant epaxial muscle mass that forms the intrinsic muscles of the back, so muscles that are just on either side of the spinal column, right along the back, and hypaxial muscles, which are all the other skeletal muscles of the body, which include the limbs as well. And so these are things that you should be familiar with based on the embryology that we talked about earlier in the week. So just to get back to where those two pink branches, those dorsal and ventral branches, and I'm using the word branches for now, we'll talk about them more specifically in a little bit, travel to, they actually travel to and from that epaxial muscle mass, the muscles right along the vertebral column, and the hypaxial muscle mass. Okay, so keep those in mind, those ideas in mind. We'll get a lot more into that, but just to introduce you to that general idea. Okay, and let's show you where those epaxial and hypaxial regions are again. So shaded here is actually the epaxial region of skin. And one thing to just point out here is that the area from which sensory supply comes back from the epaxial region is a little bit larger than the region from which we are innervating motor supply to those intrinsic back muscles. So that dorsal branch, again, I'm just using that word branch for now, that is supplying motor to just a relatively small area is bringing back sensory from a slightly larger area. So there's not a complete correlation between those. But in general, if it's from the back, or at least the center of the back, it's coming from or to that epaxial region through that dorsal branch. So I've been using this word branch, but let's get a little bit more specific, because the reality is that those structures, those nerves, are not actually called branches. So here we're seeing our diagram, and here we're seeing that dorsal branch, for the lack of a better term for now, and that ventral branch going to the epaxial and the hypaxial regions. And we're going to go from the center here and actually break down what are all of these different parts, because they have different names and they actually have different functions that are very distinct from each other. So coming out from the spinal cord, we have what we call spinal roots. And there is a dorsal root with this lump along its path. This is actually what we're going to see is a lump of cell bodies. We'll get into that in a minute. And a ventral root. And those combine together to form a mixed spinal nerve, or sometimes referred to just as a spinal nerve. So this is very important, and keep in mind this word mixed. When we think about what's mixing in there, I'll tell you in a minute the exact types of neurons that are mixing within that. And then we have a splitting off into what we call spinal rami. So one of them is a ramus, multiple are rami. And similar to the dorsal and ventral roots, we have dorsal and ventral rami. If we go back to the spinal cord itself, within this gray matter, we have these different regions that we call horns. And so there's a dorsal horn, and there's also a ventral horn. And these are important because they house cell bodies, and we'll talk about what cell bodies are in just a minute. So here's our diagram again, and when it comes to talking about function, these different portions of the nerves coming into and out from the spinal cord have very distinct functions. So our dorsal root is considered to be exclusively a sensory root, and our ventral root, for the most part, is considered to be a motor root. And the nuances there will come in much later on in part 2 of this recording. But for the most part, for now, you can consider the dorsal root to be the sensory root and the ventral root to be the motor root. Within that spinal nerve, and here's where we get that word mixed, they mix together. And so that mixing continues within the dorsal ramus and within the ventral ramus. So if I'm bringing sensory back from the epaxial region, it travels down through the ramus into the mixed spinal nerve, into the dorsal root, and into the dorsal horn. If I'm sending motor out to the epaxial region, it travels from the ventral horn through the ventral root into that mixed spinal nerve and into that dorsal ramus. So the rami contain both sensory and motor supply. The mixed spinal nerve contains both sensory and motor supply. But for the most part, the dorsal root contains only sensory, and the ventral root contains only motor. So the take-home message, rami are mixed, sensory and motor. The spinal nerve is mixed, and the roots are generally not mixed. So in addition to thinking about the pathways, we want to think about where the different parts of individual neurons are in all of this. So where are the different parts of neurons, axons, and cell bodies in all of this? And we really have not talked about nerve cells, so we're going to keep it very simple in this next diagram. So first, let's talk about motor neurons and just the general structure of motor neurons. And the only reason we're going through this is because you're going to be seeing these locations of motor neurons and sensory neurons as we go through these various diagrams, as well as the locations of synapses and the branches coming off of these. So the general structure of motor neurons, and here we're talking about going from the central portion of the nervous system towards the periphery, is that we have a cell synapsing with another neuron onto the cell body, and then in general, a single long axon coming out and then synapsing on a skeletal muscle cell. So the focus here should be on what's the relationship between the synapse point and the cell body, okay, which contains the nucleus. And that's the direction we're traveling. In contrast, sensory neurons are traveling in the other direction, so we're taking information from the periphery to the center. But also, these cell bodies containing the nucleus actually have several peripheral processes, processes. They have a peripheral process that comes into it, and then a central process that comes back into the central nervous system, and information can be brought to the central nervous system. So the fundamental difference here is really that when we're talking about motor neurons, there's a synapse directly onto the cell body from an adjacent neuron. When it comes to sensory neurons, there's a stop along the way at the cell body and at the nucleus. So we've talked in very, very general terms about the different parts of these nerves coming into and out from the spinal cord. Let's talk about where the motor and sensory cell bodies are for nerves specifically going to the body wall. And as I mentioned before, you can deduce here that we're talking about nerve supply to somatic structures. So now we're going to get into the exact pathways of how do I get motor supply to somatic structures located within the body wall, and how do I get sensory supply back from somatic structures located within the body wall. So first, let's talk about getting motor supply to somatic structures of the body wall. And here's our same diagram. Here's our epaxial muscle mass along with associated skin. Here's our hypaxial muscle mass, which would include the limbs and the vast majority of muscle within the body. And so the way that this pathway would work is we have a signal coming from the central nervous system, a synapse, and this synapse happens on motor cell bodies that are located in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. We then have a axon coming out through the ventral ramus, or I'm sorry, the ventral root, and then it will come into this mixed spinal nerve. From there, it can go to the epaxial muscle mass if needed, to go to an epaxial muscle, or it can go to the hypaxial muscle mass if the goal is to get to a muscle within this hypaxial region. So just to review that, very simple pathway. When we're getting motor supply to somatic structures of the body wall, we're not going to really talk about the central nervous system component here yet. We have motor cell bodies in the ventral horn that send out axons through the ventral root into the mixed spinal nerve. And from there, they can either go to the epaxial region or they can go to the hypaxial region. Now, how about the opposite? How about if we want to take sensory supply from somatic structures of the body wall? If we want to get sensory supply from the skin overlying the back, or, for example, the hand? Well, it's almost the opposite, not quite. I want you to remember we talked about our ventral root and our dorsal root, and we said this is the sensory root and the ventral is the motor root. So when it comes to sensory supply from the epaxial region, we travel down along the dorsal ramus into the mixed spinal nerve, and now we're going to sensory cell bodies. So think about the difference in terms of the structure of these different types of neurons, sensory and motor. There's not a synapse happening. There's more of a communication within that cell body, and here was our peripheral axon, and then there's a central axon coming back out. Sensory cell bodies are located within this ganglion, this lump called the dorsal root ganglion. And that makes sense. It's a ganglion or a collection of cell bodies located right along the dorsal root. And then we have our central axon, which comes into not the ventral horn, as the motor axons came out from, but the dorsal horn. Okay. There's a synapse here on cell bodies. Oh, we should have those cell bodies showing up. For some reason, they're not. And then we can travel up the spinal cord. The hypaxial is very similar. In this case, instead of traveling along the dorsal ramus, we're traveling along the ventral ramus from the periphery towards the center. Again, even though we're coming from the ventral area, we still have to get to these sensory cell bodies located within the dorsal root ganglion. And now we take the same path to a synapse within the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Now this happens at every single spinal level. So wherever we have somatic structures, which is at every single spinal level, we will have this same scheme happening. So now, at this point, we've really talked about the spinal cord and its different broad areas, and we've talked about these different structures coming out of and going into the spinal cord, our roots, potential ganglia along those roots, our mixed spinal nerves, our rami, and I should be able to ask you, what are the type of fibers going to and from somatic structures in each of these regions? So that ends part one. We've talked about motor supply to and sensory supply from somatic structures. And when we get into part two, we won't have to orient you to the overall spinal cord organization, but things get definitely a bit more complicated when it gets to innervation and especially motor innervation of our visceral structures, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands.